Daniel Miller, one of the youngest and most prominent tech billionaires in the world, had just set foot back in his hometown after years of traveling from one global summit to another, closing billion-dollar deals and making decisions that shaped entire markets. However, this trip wasn't for signing contracts or launching new products. It was for something far more personal. His grandmother, Helen Miller, the woman who had raised him since he was a child, was now in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's and receiving treatment in the special care unit of one of the city's most prestigious hospitals. As he walked through the quiet, sterile hallway of the hospital, Daniel couldn't help but notice the sharp scent of antiseptic, the steady beeping of heart monitors, and an underlying sense of quiet anxiety that clung to the air. The VIP ward where Helen was being treated was modern and luxurious, partially funded by the Miller Foundation, the charitable arm Daniel had established, but no amount of comfort could mask the painful truth. The disease was slowly erasing the memories of the woman he loved most. When he entered the hospital room, Daniel was taken aback to find a familiar face, Ryan Brooks, a young medical resident standing beside his grandmother, speaking gently to her and checking her vitals. She hadn't changed, the same intelligent eyes, the same soft but confident voice, and in that fleeting moment, it felt as if the years they'd been apart had simply melted away. They had once shared a brief but meaningful connection, yet busy careers and diverging paths had gradually pulled them apart. Ryan froze too the moment she saw him, the man who had swept into her life like a sudden gust of wind, only to disappear with the weight of his ambition. And now they were face to face again, not at a high-profile gala, but at the bedside of a woman fighting against time. Their unexpected reunion, filled with emotion and uncertainty, marked the beginning of a story neither of them could have foreseen. Daniel stood still for a few seconds after locking eyes with Ryan, stunned to find that the person in charge of his grandmother's care was her, the woman who had once stirred something deep inside him, but whom he had lost amidst the relentless pace of ambition and success. Ryan, meanwhile, tightened her grip on the file in her hands, trying to hide the slight tremble in her fingers. She hadn't expected that the family member of the special case patient she'd been assigned would be Daniel Miller, the young billionaire, and the storm that had once upended her heart. What should have been a simple greeting was laced with unspoken tension. Daniel gave a polite nod in the composed manner of someone used to being in control. "Thank you for taking care of my grandmother," he said, his voice low, though his eyes revealed a flicker of unease. Ryan returned a slight nod, her expression calm, but inside she was wrestling with a flood of unanswered questions. They had never really said goodbye. Their relationship had dissolved in silence, swallowed by work, distance, and everything left unsaid. After the brief encounter, Daniel asked to speak with Ryan in private. In a small meeting room beside the hospital ward, he made a proposal so unexpected that it took Ryan a few seconds to fully grasp it. He wanted her to move into the family estate to become his grandmother's full-time private physician. "I can't trust anyone else," he said, his eyes suddenly earnest. "She needs someone not just with medical skill, but with the empathy to truly connect with her." Ryan instinctively took a step back, her heart racing. The offer felt like a double-edged sword, a career opportunity too good to turn down, but also a doorway back into a past she had tried so hard to close. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice wavering between logic and fear. "Working so close together, it might not be a good idea." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment before answering, softly but firmly, "I've never been more sure of anything." The words cut through her defenses like a blade, and Ryan knew in that instant that if she said yes, nothing between them would ever be the same again. Just 3 days after that fateful conversation at the hospital, Ryan found herself sitting in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, its soundproof windows and the soft leather seats with their signature new car scent making her feel like she had entered another world, one that didn't belong to her. In front of her loomed the gates of the Miller estate, grand, cold, and intimidatingly luxurious. As the heavy iron gates creaked open, she realized she wasn't just stepping into a house, but into an entirely different life, a life now intertwined with Daniel Miller. From the very first moment Ryan set foot inside the estate, everything felt like a whirlwind. The eyes of the house staff and butlers, polite yet observant, held a certain curiosity, but none unsettled her more than Daniel's gaze. He didn't hide the fact that he had arranged everything: a private room connected directly to a personalized clinic, medical records updated by the hour, and a team ready to assist her at any moment. And just as clearly, he didn't hide the truth. He needed her here, near his grandmother, and near him. Days passed in the busy rhythm of medical routines, but it was at night, when darkness wrapped around the cold stone walls, that the silence crept in and pressed hardest on Ryan's heart. Every time she walked down the marble corridors, she could hear Daniel's footsteps somewhere in the distance, slow, steady, haunting. Their conversations, which had begun as strictly clinical, gradually blurred into memories of the past. Lingering glances, unspoken tension, long pauses, and moments held just a beat too long. One evening, as Ryan adjusted the blanket for Helen, she turned and was startled to find Daniel standing silently in the doorway. He said nothing. He just stood there, watching her. And in that moment, the professionalism she had worked so hard to maintain began to crack. The space between them was no longer filled with protocol and duty, but with a thick, suffocating tension. Something unspoken was rising between them, swelling like a storm they both knew neither could outrun. That night, the rain began to fall. Not a heavy thunderstorm, but a steady, bone-chilling drizzle, each drop seeming to fall straight into Ryan's restless mind. She had just finished her evening shift caring for Helen, who had been unusually lucid that day, repeatedly asking about Daniel and old memories she herself wasn't sure were real or just scattered fragments of her fading mind. Exhausted, Ryan returned to her room, intending to make a cup of tea to shake off the weight of the past few tense days. She hadn't expected to find Daniel already standing there when she opened the door, his dark shirt slightly damp from the rain and his gaze cutting through every wall she had carefully built around herself. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious, carrying a sense of urgency that couldn't wait. Ryan instinctively took a step back, ready to refuse, but his eyes held her in place. Not with words, but with loneliness, pressure, and something deeper, something she had seen in him long ago. They sat across from each other in the small room, the soft yellow lamp casting a warm glow across their tense expressions. The conversation began with Helen, her condition, her response to treatment. But slowly their words drifted beyond medical boundaries. Out of nowhere, Daniel confessed, "I feel a strange sense of peace when you're here. I used to think leaving was the right thing to do, but now I'm not so sure it wasn't a mistake." Ryan was speechless. Emotions she had buried began to rise: longing, hurt, desire, and fear. And before reason had a chance to intervene, he stepped closer and gently touched her cheek, softly but with a trembling sincerity. "If you tell me to stop, I will," Daniel whispered, his face just a breath away. But Ryan said nothing. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. It wasn't weakness. It was the rawest moment of truth two lost souls had waited far too long to face. And as the rain continued to fall steadily outside the window, they crossed a line that both of them knew there would be no going back from. After that rainy night, everything seemed to fall into an eerie stillness. Daniel remained busy with calls, investment plans, and international partners, but every time he passed the hallway near Ryan's room, his footsteps would slow just a little. As for Ryan, outwardly she was composed, attentive, and professional, never showing the slightest sign that their relationship had crossed a line. But inside her, a storm had begun to form, not one stirred by Daniel, but by her own body. 3 days later, Ryan started to feel tired. Not the usual kind of exhaustion from lack of sleep, but a strange fatigue, paired with nausea at the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen that morning. At first, she blamed stress, the workload, maybe even the pressure of being back in Daniel's world. But when her period was nearly a week late, and her body began reacting unusually to everyday things, a chilling instinct crept into her, like a silent warning she couldn't shake. That evening, Ryan quietly left the estate under the pretense of picking up medical files from the city hospital. In reality, she drove to a private clinic owned by a trusted colleague. No one at the estate knew, and she intended to keep it that way, at least until she was absolutely sure. When the doctor returned with the results and softly said, "Positive," Ryan couldn't find the words to speak. She simply sat there, clutching the printed report, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear through her chest. A child. The result of one night. One moment where she thought she still had control over her emotions. On the drive back, the world outside blurred. Cars drifted past like shadows. She was carrying a part of Daniel Miller, a man who had no idea what was happening, no idea that in just a few weeks, everything he believed he had under control would change forever. And Ryan wasn't sure when the truth finally came out what she'd still have left, her job, her heart, or even herself. A few days after learning she was pregnant, Ryan returned to the Miller estate with a heavy heart. Every step she took along the gleaming stone hallways felt like it pressed harder against her chest. She hadn't told Daniel, not out of fear, but because she wasn't ready. How could she drop a life-altering truth into a world already tangled in tension and responsibility? But while she was still struggling to keep the secret, someone else seemed to sense that something was off. Helen, the woman whose memories had long been strangled by time, suddenly had a moment of clarity on a sunny afternoon. As Ryan was checking her blood pressure and jotting down notes, Helen stared at her, no longer with the clouded gaze of confusion, but with sharp, focused eyes, like a blade newly sharpened after years of rust. "You seem different, Ryan," she said slowly, as if choosing every word with care. Ryan froze, the stethoscope in her hand trembling slightly. "You're hiding something from me, aren't you? Or maybe someone?" Ryan looked up, her eyes meeting Helen's penetrating gaze. This wasn't the look of an Alzheimer's patient lost in time. No, this was the look of a grandmother, of a woman who had once been the pillar of a powerful family, and now, as she slowly lost everything else, still clung tightly to her intuition. "I've been pregnant before. I know that look, that walk," Helen whispered. "And if I'm not mistaken, the father isn't a stranger in this house, is he?" Ryan stood still, her throat tightening. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. But her silence was answer enough. Helen nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with a mix of worry and hope. "Daniel doesn't know, does he?" Ryan gave a small nod, and for the first time she saw tears welling in the eyes of the once steely woman. "You have to tell him," Helen murmured. "Not just for you, but for the child. Before I forget who I am, I need to know that this family won't lose another one of its own." News of Daniel's return swept through the Miller estate like an unexpected breeze, shifting the atmosphere into one of hushed urgency. The staff moved quietly, straightening curtains, wiping away even the faintest speck of dust from the dark mahogany surfaces. Ryan stood by the second-floor window, her palm pressed against the cold glass, eyes fixed on the main gate. Her heart felt like stone. He would be back in just a few hours, and she, the one carrying a part of him, still hadn't found a way to speak the truth. Helen was unusually quiet that day. Since their conversation a few days ago, she seemed to drift into a thoughtful stillness, as if her mind was clinging to its final moments of clarity, preparing for something important. Each time Ryan passed by, Helen would gently squeeze her hand, her gaze silently urging, "Don't wait any longer." That afternoon, a sleek black SUV slid through the gates. Daniel stepped out, wearing a dark coat, his eyes weary from the long flight. But the moment he saw his grandmother waiting at the steps, his expression softened. He knelt down, took her hand, and whispered something Ryan couldn't hear, but she saw the light return to Helen's eyes, a joy that hadn't been there in a long time. Moments later, Daniel's gaze shifted to Ryan, standing just a few steps away. For a second, time seemed to freeze, too much left unsaid, too many emotions held back. Ryan instinctively took a step back, but he moved toward her. "Are you okay?" he asked. his voice rough with travel and emotion, eyes scanning her face. Ryan nodded, forcing a smile as she subtly placed a hand over her abdomen, a reflex she couldn't quite control. Daniel didn't press further, but his eyes lingered, slowing, narrowing slightly, as if he sensed something was different. There wasn't much time left to hide. Helen was growing weaker by the day. The child inside Ryan was growing stronger by the hour. And now that Daniel was back, Ryan knew the truth couldn't stay buried much longer. But would she have the courage to say it before everything exploded in a way she never intended? That evening, the Miller estate was cloaked in a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Dinner was served in a small dining room, not the grand hall, but a cozy space where Helen used to eat with her family years ago. Daniel sat beside his grandmother, his hand never leaving hers, while Ryan sat across from them, doing her best to remain composed under his occasional glances. No one spoke of the baby, but the tension between them was taut, like a string pulled to its limit, waiting for the slightest touch to snap. After dinner, Daniel gently walked Helen back to her room. Ryan stood still, watching them disappear down the hall, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, her breath unsteady. Tonight, she told herself, tonight she would tell him. She had waited too long. Daniel deserved to know, and she deserved to be free from the weight of secrecy that had been eating away at her day by day. When Daniel returned, he found Ryan in the small library, the soft yellow glow of the lamp casting pale light on her tired face. He walked over and quietly sat across from her. "You look exhausted," he said gently, his gaze softening. "There's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" Ryan's throat tightened. This was the moment. She opened her mouth, searching for the words. "Daniel, there's something important I need to tell you. It's about that night, and everything after." But just then a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. A servant stood at the threshold, breathless, face pale. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Miss Helen, she's having a panic episode. She's screaming your name, sir. She won't take her medicine, and she keeps mentioning a child." Daniel stood up almost instantly, his expression shifting from gentle concern to alarm. "I have to go to her." Ryan nodded, even as her heart dropped like a stone. Once again, the truth was swallowed by circumstance. Once again, she was left behind, her confession still stuck in her chest. She rose slowly, placed a hand over her stomach, and whispered softly to the life growing inside her, "Soon. I'll tell him. I promise." Helen was brought back to her bedroom in a state of distress, mumbling Daniel's name and the child. Ryan followed close behind, her heart pounding, partly from worry for Helen and partly because she knew this episode wasn't entirely irrational. It was a reflection of lingering memories, a spark of clarity rising through the fog of illness. Daniel sat beside the bed, holding his grandmother's frail hand. Ryan stood in the corner of the room, hands clasped tightly in front of her. But then something no one expected happened. Helen suddenly calmed down. Her eyes opened wide and locked onto Ryan's, this time with no confusion, no haze. "You're here," she said, her voice startlingly clear, making both Daniel and Ryan freeze. "Good, because I have something to say, and I want the truth." The air in the room thickened. Daniel turned to Ryan, his expression clouded. "What truth?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, searching and finding fear. Helen took a breath, her voice growing weaker but still steady. "Daniel, you're going to be a father, aren't you?" Ryan stood frozen. Daniel stared at her, stunned. "What?" There was no turning back now. Ryan stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. I meant to tell you, so many times, but things kept getting in the way and I was afraid of ruining everything." Daniel stood up, taking a step back. His face didn't show anger, only shock. You're pregnant? It's mine?" Ryan gave a small nod, her eyes brimming with tears. Helen exhaled deeply as if her final task had been completed. "That child, will carry the Miller name, and it deserves to be welcomed with truth, not silence. Daniel turned away for a long moment. The room was utterly silent. Then, slowly, he turned back, his eyes filled with a storm of emotion, confusion, wonder, and something deeper still, responsibility, and a love that had never quite disappeared. The air in the room remained thick after the truth had been spoken. Daniel stood still, his back to Ryan, arms hanging at his sides as if he were holding himself together by sheer will. Ryan didn't dare breathe too deeply. She knew this moment could be the beginning or the end of everything. But then he turned around slowly and the panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm that was impossible to read. "I wish you'd told me sooner," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "But I understand. You were just trying to protect everything. The way you always cared for my grandmother, the way you cared for me, even when I didn't realize it." Ryan couldn't hold back her tears. She had always feared that the truth would break the fragile bond between them, but now it was the truth itself that made everything suddenly clear. In all the chaos and uncertainty of life, sometimes the only thing strong enough to truly connect two people is honesty. Daniel stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," he whispered, "but I want to be with you and with our child." There were no grand promises, no rings, no vows, just a look of sincerity and a simple but profound commitment. Ryan nodded, her heart lightening, as if the burden she had carried for weeks had finally been set down. Helen, now resting and drifting off to sleep, still wore a peaceful smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment before letting go. Outside the window, a gentle breeze moved through the garden, and the rose petals swayed softly under the late afternoon sun. A future awaited them, not one that promised ease, but one that felt real. And perhaps the greatest lesson they had come to understand was this: sometimes courage doesn't come from having control over everything, but from letting go of fear and facing what we truly desire.